This is Groove of War and the Take Your Turn 2022 tournament. Take Your Turn is composed of 3 events: Wargroove, Chess, and Go. More details on the tournament in the description. My name is Arn Fosta, and as you might have guessed, I'll be your Go commentator. OGS puts me at about 7Q at the moment, but it's also been a while since I played actively, so I'd estimate, for anyone curious, that I'm probably between 8 and 10Q on OGS. As such, the commentary is going to be aimed more at newer players and players in the double-digit queue. Now, if you do spot any mistakes, things I missed, please leave them in chat or in the comments. I'm learning alongside everybody else. So today, we're going to be looking at round 1, game 1, between Spotyus on black and Saykoya on white. So I've picked out a couple moves that we're going to look at. For the sake of brevity, I'm not going to go every one. When I tried to do that, it was about 2.5 hours. If anyone is interested, by all means, let me know, and I'll be happy to make that available as well. But I'll try to focus for the moment on some of the key moves, and we start out pretty early. So I'm going to go a little bit further so we can get some more context here. But I think already there's some interesting things to talk about that clearly signal this is not going to be your average game. So we start out the very beginning up here with e4, right from the get-go. Black signals that they are interested in playing towards the center, which would generally suggest black is willing to forego easy, safe points or a more standard game, and is interested in playing more influence-based. Another way to think about it is black is looking to play, in some ways, a long game. That's a bit simplistic. But if we look at them in two very, very basic categories, black is essentially saying with e14 in this first move, and then certainly with the follow-up with f6 in move 3, black is saying, I am going to disregard having an easy base. In other words, I'm going to disregard playing safe in a way that gives me stability on the corner, and instead, I am going to play in the center with the idea that I can build up a lot of influence, a lot of stones that have that can be utilized by many other stones very quickly. And I'm confident that although I may start behind, I'm going to be able to utilize those stones later in the game, set them up so they'll become critical and give me a decisive edge to eventually turn them into points. So for example, if we look at the difference between a d4 stone and an e14 stone, so Saykoya plays a d4 at the very beginning in the bottom left here, and that's a very standard move. It's very safe, and it's focused much more in the left corner. So what it means is that Saykoya has strong influence in that left corner. It means it's much easier to move from this stone at d4 to the left, to the right, out to the sides, but very easy to start to build a framework and have the edges to fall back on to be able to build life quickly. It doesn't guarantee life, obviously, by any means. But if you compare that up here to e14, d4 is much more concentrated in this corner. So when you start talking about stones that might be out in the center, stones that are, more towards the right, your d4 stone is looking further and further away, less and less influence. And conversely, that e14 being much closer to the center means that it can play off of a lot more potential moves. At the same time, it's kind of floating there. It's just sitting there in the wide open field without anything yet for it to really build on and latch with and for it to turn into anything. And so a large part of the question is black going to be able to transfer this momentum that they're trying to build into points? Or will the rug sort of be pulled out from under them, and although they'll have these stones in the center or around the center, they won't be able to translate that into the actual territory and points that they need in the end to win. From there, I think another thing that's really worth talking about a bit is this play at h6, which I believe is move 5. So with h6, I think the intent was twofold. The first is that white starts at d4 here and then responds to black black's f6 play with their f5, saying, if you want to get close to me, I'm going to push back against you. And that's nice because it not only does it strengthen your original d4 stone, it gives you a nice framework here to sort of push out, to be able to build to your right, and you're still close enough to the sides that you can easily fall back. It creates what looks to me to be a pretty stable stable setup, and it allows white to very, very heavily pressure black, relatively speaking. White is literally touching the black stone, trying to force it and put it under threat. The fact that the f6 stone here, though, is out in the center means that it's certainly not going to die immediately, and it has a whole board right now with which to move. So black looks to respond here with a play at h6, which certainly does strengthen your f6 play a minute ago. It gives your that lone stone. It now has a buddy. You've got a little more structure you can begin to work with and play off of now that you have two stones. And I think the thing that it does do is that it creates some pressure, I think. So the way I mentally see the framework building is that white has some momentum toward the right, a framework that is naturally building towards the right. And this stone at h6 does allow black to begin to put on pressure, to kind of wedge in between, to either stop white or push white down and kind of try to contain white and keep it from building too much influence too quickly. The thing for me, though, is when I compare that against a couple other moves, I think there's some other possibilities that might have been stronger in this instance. So if we look at what else black could do, I think there are a couple of things worth discussing as I try to remember my shortcuts. So one of them is, so we have the original move at A. I think another one worth discussing is a move at B. And then honestly, another move, if they really want to go, if Spotyus or another influence player really wants to stick with this influence-based play, I'm a lot less familiar with it, so I'm much less comfortable. But in my mind, I would be looking at, though I'm wouldn't necessarily commit to this, I might be looking at something like a P5 play at C, and I'll explain that in a second. So if we start with B, my thought process here is, if you're really concerned about that f6 stone coming under heavy fire, or you really feel that that f6 stone here is critical to your larger plan and it needs to be stable, it does make sense to reinforce it. It feels a bit slow in this context with so many points on the board, so much space still available to make use of. To play a 1-point jump to start with feels like that might be a bit slow to me. Just sort of as a feeling, not a hard rule by any means. But let's say that you feel like it is necessary, that it's important to keep this. You can do what Spotyus did with A, and that is a way to strengthen, put some pressure on it. I think that a play at D6 as an alternative would do a couple things for you. It still gives you a 1-point jump, so your f6 stone is still strengthened. One thing it does do that the move at A does not is it gets you closer to your side. It helps you build stronger influence quicker. You're better grounded, is how I like to think of it. You're not floating in space in the way that you are with A. So it does that, but more importantly in my mind, in addition to pushing toward the side or giving you more leverage on the side, it also feels like it works a little better in direct tandem with E14, because by pulling back, you're keeping that E14 stone as part of this overall structure. Whereas with A, you're moving away from your E14 stone, which is fine. But in terms of when I'm comparing the two ideas, I like the D6, I think it has some merit. The one thing it doesn't do is it doesn't pressure white as strongly. I think there are other ways to pressure white if that's your ultimate goal, but it's true that by pulling back at B, you can threaten to try and maybe make some shenanigans happen in the corner, but it's a lot less pressure, for example, than something that pushes you towards the center where there is all this open space and you can try to get ahead of white. So I could see that being a reason you ultimately go for something like A. One other thing I wanted to mention, though, was a potential C play or a P5 or somewhere around there. Basically, in this very early stage of the game, if you are going to go for an influence-based play, you are trying, in my mind, you are trying to play wide, you are trying to play big, and you are trying to set yourself up so that you can capitalize on the stones you are setting now a little bit later down the line. As such, because your F6 stone, even though it's being threatened by the F5, isn't in any immediate danger, I might consider simply moving to another corner of the board, to another section, setting yourself up, trying to get ahead, establish a stone lead in that area, and perhaps if white decides, hey, I'm really gonna try and take this F6 stone down, you could choose to come back and try and defend it. You could also, again, just say, sure, if you're going to spend all that time in this one corner, let me go bigger. Let me keep building up in the other side. So if I play at C, and white goes, oh, let me play at A, or let me play at a G6 play, you could say, sure, that's great. Let me go ahead and play up here in this top right corner. Let me build a bigger framework so that by the time you've taken the bottom left, I'm ready to come back and take the rest of the board. So I think that if you're going for that influence-based style, really committing to it early on is absolutely something to consider. So we'll go a little bit further in the game to what for me is probably the biggest move and one of the most interesting that happens. So you can see as things begin to develop, black ends up strengthening that lower left, and I think this is one thing where I think it absolutely makes sense to you set that up early. You want to keep it alive. I do wonder about if black had chosen to play a little bit bigger, and it would have perhaps resulted in black having a weaker position in the bottom left, but could have done a lot more on the right side of the board or the top of the board in a way that would have potentially given black a lot more influence across the board rather than just a single space. And even though black started with an influence-based play, we can see that right now white has a pretty decent influence across the whole bottom here, and is also trying to position itself to be able to make influence on the top the right hand side as well. So I think that black, in my mind, wasn't able to capitalize, at least yet, on the idea of being able to play bigger yet, and that white currently has a stronger foundation at the moment and a stronger lead. But so there's a strengthening here and this back and forth, and we can see both players are really trying to get this settled and concentrated, make sure so the play is very concentrated here. And so at that point, we're basically settled, right? White is going to force that. And at that point, that part of it is done. One thing to mention, of course, is that black could absolutely try to play here and force at least a response from white. It wouldn't necessarily be a big move, but it's one that white would like. As far as I could read, would need to respond to. So one thing to consider, especially as you're just getting into this, is that there are times in which, so if we talk about that A3 play, you may recognize that, your opponent may recognize that, simply because you recognize the existence of a threat. As you get more comfortable, there are many times in which you'll want to make note of it and say, that's there, that's a forcing move, that's absolutely something I can play that white is going to need to respond to. But then you hold from playing, you refrain from playing there. And the big reason we talk about that often comes up is the idea of co-threats. So if you get yourself into a crucial co where, well, now you can see that the end state of the game, which we'll look at as well, but we're going to jump ourselves back to move 39. If you get yourself into a situation where the you have a crucial co-fight and you need to have some way to force your opponent to move somewhere else so that you can retake the stone and keep the ko going, any of these moves here, these forcing moves, these ko threats, where then they have to be big enough relative to what you're trying to fight against, important enough for the opposing player to say, I'm not going to end the ko. But oftentimes you will refrain from settling something like this because you'll use it later as a way to keep that going. And keeping track of where those are and keeping track of how you're going to use them is obviously a big part of the game as you get going. And so if you're starting out and you resolve a lot of these, it makes it's a very common thing to do. But as you get more comfortable, consider, as long as you read it as safe, as long as you're not under any immediate danger, as long as them taking advantage of it isn't going to be destructively harmful to the game, consider leaving it open and seeing if you can utilize it later for even more impact. So what I want to talk about here is after the left-hand side is settled, white then comes in, black closes at h5, white jumps at j7, and it's the move after that black does that I think is sets off a whole, this and it's the black's follow-up that set off a whole chain of events that take a game that was sitting in the bottom left and sends it all over the board. So we're looking at this K6 stone, and I want to talk a little bit, I want to show you what it does and what happens, and then come back to it a little bit later to explore what other alternatives might be possible and why we might be interested in those. So we look at this, and in my mind, this play at K6 is black saying, I want to cut you off in some way. I don't want to let you just get this connect for free. I want to put pressure on these stones, and so I am going to make you choose. By peeping here, one of these is white is most likely going to choose one of these, in which case then black will most likely choose the other. The alternative is black could simply play directly at K6 or K5. I'm not sure in this case whether the move at K6 ended up being very beneficial, because if there was another intent, I'm not sure I'm currently seeing it. And the result of the way it played out is that you are saying, hey, white, here are two threats, you choose. So you end up kind of giving the control in my mind over to white in this particular instance. You say, you decide which one you want to do, and then I'll back up and do the other one, is currently how I'm looking at it, or currently how I'm reading that. So there may be something more there, but I'm not seeing anything. And the result is that, in my mind, you end up losing the initiative. Whereas if you knew which way you wanted to go, or you could read and figure out that one was better than the other, it seems like you would want to just move there directly instead of allowing black to decide, or excuse me, instead of allowing white to decide which one you would go with. But so white ends up connecting at J6, and then this follow-up move here is J8, is black saying, I refuse I refuse to let things go. I refuse to say this is done. I refuse to let you have an easy jump straight into the center, out to the side. I am going to do my best to squash you. I think this may have ended up being a little aggressive. If I'm understanding the intent correctly, it makes a lot of sense. You're really worried about white taking these three stones and beginning to run amok in what you're hoping will be your territory. So you want to clamp down, you want to push back strongly. The issue, I think in this instance, or at least the potential issue here, is that it's one thing to play a move like J8 if you also had stones at K7 and K5, or even stones at maybe even stones at a stone at K7, where you had a little bit of extra strength more directly connected. But because right now you're creating one stone by itself, another stone to the right by itself, and a group of three that does not have many liberties here, right? So just has 2, of which now white could choose to threaten by immediately playing at h7. In this instance, I think that it's starting to stretch yourself thin, in that in trying to lead on the attack, you are creating an incentive for white to split you up and begin to create a number, or the possibility of creating a number of weak groups that you have to try to simultaneously defend from an ever-growing white. That's the big concern in this situation when you begin to jump like this. It's also different too, for example, or it may also make more sense if you had, maybe not even directly, but if you had stones back here, you had extra stones in this area where you feel like, or your reading would be, okay, you can push me, but I have stones further out on the board that are ready to lend a hand when things get hairy. But at the moment, it feels like everything else is so far away that isn't necessarily going to pan out. So here's what actually happens. So white does push out, black goes to strengthen this side group, and then white comes around, is able to force that closed, and is now trying to create a group here. I wonder if it wouldn't have been more effective. And this is amusing more than anything, for white to be a little bit more direct, to cause the close, and then if white wanted to, white could jump up perhaps, or white could just even come up by 1. In the situation that white has, it ends up working out here, but noticeably and importantly, these stones right there are cut. So they are 2 separate groups that are each vulnerable individually. Whereas if white had connected, that then white still gets to push to the left and potentially into the center, but is a lot more difficult to be divided, and I think a little more strongly would begin to isolate this J8 stone. So there are times in which you absolutely want to make these cuts, and it's not like this group here is under immediate threat. So Spotyus may have read that and absolutely decided that there was enough there white would be able to use, but it's also something to consider, that sometimes you'll be a little less aggressive in order to keep that group stronger if you think that it will give you a better base from which to work from. And so from here, we have this back and forth. I think white does a very nice job of, with this play at J9, of finding the double Atari, seeing that by playing here at J9, white or black then has to choose which stone they want to save because they can't save both. And this middle battle continues for quite a while. You can see it begins to sprawl out. And again, we have this side group that black is trying to move out, trying to protect. We now have a center group that's developed that black is trying to protect and white is trying to press. And we have a third group that black is also trying to protect. So what started all the way back here as just a single group and just trying to head it off, a couple dozen moves later, ends up being this huge, sprawling series of battles where black is trying to fight a number of fronts simultaneously. So before we jump further on that, if we go back and look at move 39, if we go back and look at move 39, I think an alternative to consider would be your J6 play. So your J6 play would do a couple things. If white chooses to simply connect back, then you can connect with K6, and you've effectively begun to separate their white's J7 stone and built yourself a foundation that's not easily broken, and giving yourself a little bit more leverage here. So I think in that case, if your goal is to separate them, that probably does so a little more strongly. Another alternative would be if white tries to go ahead and try to fight it and contest it. So in that case, I was trying to read earlier. I'm not sure whether you would want to push up first and then go ahead and take, or whether you would want to, whether it makes sense to try and push early and then try to utilize the fact that white's group has not fully strengthened to create some chaos. And it gets the reading begins to get messy. You're also dealing with a ko, although the ko itself isn't necessarily the most important. I think that there may be that one. I think requires some more reading, but has some merit. And they create situations that aren't simple, and they are difficult to read. But in my mind, what I can see from the get-go is that if I choose to play at k6, white has the option to play at j6, and suddenly I know that these two stones, these two groups are separated, and they're separated by a group of white stones that I think would be difficult to break through. So I think it's not an ideal situation to be in for black, but in terms of risk assessment, at the moment j6 in my mind looks a little better, but obviously we can also consider an alternative play here if we're looking at just the two other options besides k6. This move at k5, where you encourage white to go ahead and connect. In this instance, you can at least begin to strengthen earlier. You are taking the pressure off of white, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend trying to go ahead and attack white directly, because your k5 stone is even weaker. But I do think if you choose to back off a little bit, your k5 stone can then be strengthened, and there is at least the potential for you to try to move both to the right and inward to give yourself some more space to play with. How that space translates into territory or the reduction of territory is less clear to me, and I would before I committed to a move like this, I would want to take a minute or two to go ahead and read out a little bit more to see whether it really looks favorable. But I think those are both worth considering, because it seems like when you make a move like this, you're expecting white to either play at A or B, in which case take the other, or go ahead and play where you want to, where it looks the most ideal for you. So if we're looking at the way this begins to sprawl out, and so we can see that as white continued to pressure black, there's a moment I want to jump back to that I think is really cool. Black is also trying to keep itself alive in this right-hand side, and you can see with a move like n12, white still seems like they haven't given up on trying to attack this group, which I feel like is ambitious, but is admirable. It is, as the groups get bigger, you do have to be conscious of falling into the trap of wanting to kill something because you planned to originally, or it was close originally. There may be times in which trying to go after the kill so aggressively ends up creating weak groups, ends up costing you points because you take inefficient moves in order to try and make that kill. Well, I think we'll look at one of those a little bit later. But the move I wanted to touch on real quick is, so black plays at O10 here, and white doesn't catch it, is focused on those three black stones and responds with O12. And black could, if they wanted to, they could play at A right here and take those stones. But instead, one of the things I think they do that's interesting and a nice sequence is, let's say they do that, if we explore that. White could probably turn around and play at P11. Black would be okay, but now white would have gotten those three stones to help begin to act as a wall and begin to act as an impasse, making it more difficult for black to try and get into the upper right. So I think one of the things that Spotyus does well is identifies that they don't need to take that immediately. When white goes at O12, Spotyus can play at P11, and white will then choose to go ahead and play at Q10. And after playing at Q10, then black decides now it's time. Spotyus decides now it's time to take those stones. And instead of only having one liberty in this side, now we have two. We have a little more room to work with, a little more potential than we would have had otherwise. And so I think that sequence ends up working out very well for Spotyus. And so we see, and again, with those attacks, we see how quickly, as soon as these two stones are gone, what used to be, or what used to look like a strong structure, we now have this white group that looks like it's a little weak. We certainly have a potential cut here, another cut here, and the possibility for some danger in this area as well. So once it looks like black has some strength in this group, the situation turns around, and white is now trying to figure out how they can put on pressure, or at the very least how they can survive. And so we have this battle that evolves in the right hand side, like this. There are a couple moves like this that I think are completely fine. This play at S9, and if we look here as well, the play at T10, those moves, in order to solidify, remove any doubt, get them off the board, I think absolutely make sense. And when you need to do them, you do them. But I think they're maybe not the most efficient play. And one of the reasons that ends up being important is that when black decides to play at S9, you do remove those stones off the board. My reading of it is that black isn't really in any danger and can respond, and so it isn't necessary. And so as long as that reading is correct, as long as I'm correct in that, even if white plays first, black does not need to worry, right? So what I would do, move this here. I think in my mind, I would have played T12 to threaten both groups. That way, if white then chooses to ever come in with an S9 play, you can take and be just fine. Or conversely, if white were to ever try this, you could take that and still be just fine. Without that, if we say play over here and white takes, the other thing about it is you can still get white down to a single group. If anything, I think it's probably more important for black to respond with T12 to prevent the two groups here from linking up and making it difficult to fully cut them off. But from there, just so we can play it out, even if white tries to take, white now has one eye here and is most likely going to go for another eye. If we make this a different, go for an eye in one of these two circles. The issue is, since it's black's turn, black can go ahead and play here and cut that eye off, prevent the formation of the second eye. There are some possible shenanigans with a play at R6, with R7, at the 6 move that you'd wanna double check, but this is absolutely where the reading can be. You want to go through and do that reading to double check. But I think that at worst, you would want to play the T12 first, and so you would play one move instead of two. By playing both those moves, it's 2 times in which you cede your initiative. And now your opponent can decide where to play next. It allows them to set the pace of the game. It allows them to set the tempo, set the focus. So the more you're able to keep that is obviously the better. And so when you don't need to kill, when you're certain that you'll be safe and you don't need to kill, holding on that kill in order to be able to continue to hold the initiative, I think, can be really beneficial. So if we move a little bit further, for example, one of the things that black might do, or I think is worth talking about, what else could black do, right? So if black, instead of playing, say, if black wanted some of the safety, instead of playing at S9, simply playing at T12, and then white plays elsewhere, where else might black go? Or if black felt they were completely okay, where else could black go? Where's the initiative? Where might the initiative be? This space is currently open, and I think that black could try to get aggressive if they wanted to directly. I'd be curious about what might be possible in the corner that could branch off in either direction, though I think you would need to settle this a little bit more before you'd want to launch something like that. But in both cases, you have an opportunity to really invade white's territory and at the least reduce it by a good amount. even more importantly than that, you have this whole area in which you could try to begin to stake your claim, and at the very least reduce what black has. Try to use this E14 stone and begin to convert it into convert that influence into a stronger, more defined territory in the long term. Begin to play some pieces here that would give you the kind of structure you need to prevent white from trying to invade, or prevent white from invading successfully. And that might also include going ahead and trying to solidify some of this area. You've got, this cutting point here and another right here where there are some concerns about what happens if white's able to push through. And we'll actually see some of that in a minute. But I think that there are some other big moves on the board that are potentially worth more than a double move to reduce these stones and take them out off the map. But at the same time, as I said, obviously if you're still learning, it isn't always about pure optimization. And as you get stronger and get more confident in your reading, you can do things like leave this open with more confidence, or play the one move instead of the two with more confidence. If you are uncertain and you can't read it and you're worried, at the end of the day, I think it's worth making a mental note to go back and spend some time reading later. But you can always do what Spotyus did here, which is to go ahead and play the potentially less efficient move to make sure that a mistake doesn't happen later down the line because you thought it might be okay. And then we have this part here that I think is really interesting. So this is a nice push in with black. And what black has set up here is a couple of places where black could cut, where black could cut through and potentially cause some shenanigans. Now, in the game, black chooses to go with Q7, which again makes sense. It's an easy reduction move. I think that because this black group isn't in any immediate danger, and because this reduction doesn't drastically change the shape or state of the white group, I would probably hold a move like Q7, though it's still a good move. I would hold it for, again, one of the other moves we talked about, and play one of those and come back to Q7 much later in the game when you're trying to reduce. What I wanted to talk about was what other possibilities existed. So instead of, when you play Q7, you now make it very difficult for any attacks to happen here. But if you hold and instead go ahead and pressure with a play at 05, you are then, if white chooses to go ahead and solidify, you have a fancy play here at P6 that looks like it threatens just the 06 stone. But if white chooses to go ahead and strengthen that stone by connecting it back together, you can then take everything. Now, it's not likely to happen, but that's the threat that you're setting up. So most likely, instead, white would pull back to keep the group of 3 stones alive, and then you can go ahead and take. And now you're still not likely to be able to come in here and destroy all of this, but you have a much stronger base to continue trying to reduce a little bit, and you can get a few more points out that way. Again, relative to what else might happen on the board in these spaces over here, I think that they're worth a lot less. But locally, that's another way that you can approach this, and you can look to utilize multiple threats or consecutive threats to give you some advantages. So from 137, we're going to go ahead, and you can see this continues for a little bit. Black does a really nice job here with S5 of seeing this vulnerability and taking advantage of it. I think ultimately black ends up being a little greedy. So I think Saykoya probably should have, or would have been more beneficial point-wise, to go ahead and take what you were able to get and go ahead and connect. And that by not connecting, you leave yourself more vulnerable, as we'll see in a second. But this would at least allow you to go ahead and get these points, and then if you ever wanted to, you could even throw in and force another point or two later on. But that would reduce white territory, and also you wouldn't lose any stones for it. Black instead goes in to see if, I'm assuming, try to see if they can get a kill on this group here. But I think you've got 3 liberties plus this 4th liberty. It looks difficult to me in order to be able to pull that off, especially with white's move here, which is a really nice response that reduces this attacking group here to only 2 liberties. And you do have a co-fight here, right? So there's some, in theory, there's potential possibilities, but this white group, or these black stones are definitely not doing so hot. And I think that this is one of those times in which it's hard to read exactly how this pans out. And I might have considered also even coming from the opposite side as well, right? So trying to threaten to capture that stone and seeing if you could make anything happen. I'm not able to read any way to make that happen at the moment. It might be that you would want to set that up ahead of time, set up something on the left before you initiate it on the right, in order to really see that through. I think, though, it's very unlikely you could actually capture this group because of how few liberties you have, and the way in which, importantly, the way in which as you begin to cut down liberties, you are also reducing your own liberties. So you see how at this play with Q5, black is playing another stone, but black is still at 2 liberties. Black has not gained any liberties, and it's still, again, 2 versus 3. And I think for that reason, I would opt for a different route, probably something a little less aggressive. And the other thing is, I think sometimes it definitely makes sense if you can see a way to push forward, go for it. But there are times in which when you're in a situation like this, if you can't see a way forward, it's fine to leave it, to look elsewhere. That if you get to a position like this and it doesn't look like you can make it out alive, rather than exacerbate the issue, and we see here those stones end up getting taken, go ahead and leave it. Worst case, there was a failed attack. Potentially something that the other thing to consider, though, is if you leave it now, you can come back to it later. You may be able to read something later. You may be able to utilize it later. But so this is, in my mind, particularly useful when you're not confident in how to finish it. That's always an option. But so these do get taken, and then black is now trying to move up into the top corner, which I think is nice. I think at this point, white does have a much stronger foundation, a much stronger wall to begin to create this, a structure that black is now trying to jump into, and you can see it just in this image. In the top here, it is 1 black stone against a group of white stones. It's a little bit of an uphill battle, but I'm glad that Spotyus is trying to get in there, trying to make something happen and prevent white from simply locking down that entire space. So this move I did want to spend a little time on too. So this F10 play that Saykoya makes is a really clever, smart insight. So in this cutting point here, it's doing a couple things. The first is that it's most directly threatening this group of 5 stones. It is also giving you a way to begin to put pressure on this left-hand side. And what's crucial is if we look at this giant group of stones, that's a lot of black stones. Those black stones don't have any eyes. There is no space, no territory for any of those black stones established right now, which means they are a giant group of stones waiting to be captured unless they can get themselves 2 eyes. And so this cutting move right here ends up, yes, pressuring these 5 black stones directly, but setting up to allow you to simultaneously begin to make black's life very difficult in trying to defend that large group. And so we see black goes to defend the immediate and by doing that, encourages white to play toward the side. And so every time we attack our opponent, we are inviting them to strengthen themselves, and we also have to be conscious of how we think they're going to strengthen themselves and what that will mean for the board state. So black is trying to defend this group, but in so doing, inadvertently helps white create a stronger attack on this larger group of stones. And at this point here, black, I think one thing that black does identify at this point is that it's true that black could play at A and prevent those 3 stones from being captured, but that doesn't change the bigger problem that there is less and less space for black to move through in order to try and create eyes, or at least in order to try and get out to find life. And I think that in my mind is a pretty high priority, seeing if we can use a play at B. B in my mind looks to be the most promising, potentially a play at C. I think potentially a play at C if you did that. So we say, sure, we're going to play off in the corner here for a second. So if black goes C, if white tries to cut, it's a little dicey. It might come up a little bit short. So at the very least, the 2-point jump at B9 here probably ends up being safer. But I think that black should be trying to figure out what they can do with that, and if there is a way that they can get themselves out. And even just getting themselves out onto this side, you can then look to utilize the E14 stone. You've got the whole upper corner. There's some options for you. So from here, so this is one we should watch a little closely. So we have black is trying to lock down these stones. White tries to jump out. Black is trying to continue to pressure. And so once we get here, I think black does a really nice job of recognizing that that this right here is a false eye. And so black can absolutely capture this. Another thing, and so I think one thing for Saykoya it would be good to keep in mind, and for other players who are playing on the corner, because it's so easy to forget about this. Situations like this, where you leave open a play along the corner, along the edge, can really leave open some vulnerabilities. So if black decided to play black could choose to run, black could instead decide to get aggressive, and sure, you can take that, but black could use that to then try to move inward and to begin to basically jump over and start to build a framework inside that becomes difficult to deal with. So it's important, and we saw that happen a little bit as well down here as well in a similar situation. So keeping in mind when you go to stop something like this, often you'll want to go ahead, for black that would be a great play. Often you'll want to make sure that you do go ahead and lock that down with a play at O18 or N18 depending on the situation, or at least on the corner. At least those probably make the most sense. Elsewhere you might just go ahead and play to the left, but on the corner it probably makes the most sense to just lock it down to prevent those things from happening. That's also different too if you already had a stone here. You might feel like there are so many other bigger moves to play. Even if black were to try and attack, you could stand to lose a stone or two and be fine. But you should at least know that you might be making that sacrifice, and make it consciously. Because the game is all about trade-offs, and so those things do happen. So we see here black ends up taking. I think again in this situation, if we read it out, white doesn't actually have a way to kill black, and so I think black could have, instead of playing at T18, could have chosen to play elsewhere and take the initiative. And it's not the end of the world by any means that black chose to settle it, But now white can choose where to go next, and white can choose what part of the story we tell next. And the part starts to put black in a hard position. And you can see the c8 play is really nice. It really makes it even more difficult for black to try to find anything to escape out. And at that point, then the question in my mind is there anything possible here? Is there any way you can turn this around and be aggressive with it? And I'm not sure there is. So for example, another thing would be, if we look at this, black is going to be able to strengthen this group of 3 stones here. But at the same time, white is then going to connect, which makes this group a little stronger than it was before. I'd need to read through more, but potentially something like this feels like it has a little more promise. Now granted, as soon as white takes, you're in trouble either way, so it might have made more sense. You might have needed to first try and strengthen and then look for an opportunity, if white doesn't immediately close off, to come back and try to split. But if we consider one or the other, that split then doesn't, your groups are still in trouble, and it's not necessarily a great position for you, but it does allow you to attack 2 separate groups and try to take down 2 different sets of liberties as opposed to 1 full set of liberties with them combined. So we have this play here where black is trying to figure out where they can go. And I think that one of the things I'd recommend is this, again, in terms of strengthening an immediate stone, this does make sense. In terms of moving and getting into that space, this is a way. But the speed at which it happens is very slow compared to the fact that you are in heavy and very hot water all around you. And so rather than look to strengthen the immediate stone, I might ask myself, what is my ultimate goal in this area, and from there, what moves might I do? So if my ultimate goal is to try to really get territory here, then this N15 stone might not be that important. And instead, maybe I want to try and threaten to connect so that I can do something, try to pull back to the E14, though I think that's a bit big. Maybe I want to just start by playing, back here at H15, or even back here at G16. Maybe I want to start further back, and I can always be looking to link up with this N15 stone if it makes sense. But there are times in which you will want to let something lay and not necessarily reinforce it unless it's going to directly support the cause that you're working with. So we're coming up on about an hour, so I'm going to go ahead. I'm trying to keep it to about an hour. So I'm going to go ahead and finish up the rest of this. There's definitely a lot of interesting things about this, and more I would love to talk about. I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, my original review ended up being 2 hours, because I feel like there are a lot of things here to unpack. A lot of moves that where there were a lot of good insights, and a lot of situations in which the intent made a lot of sense. I think there was good intuition, but the order or the execution ended up not working out for a couple different reasons. But in terms of the overall game state, as we start to wrap up, we can see that black is trying to get into this upper center, as we talked about a couple times, and white is doing a good job of just creating barrier after barrier after barrier. And so that there are a bunch of black stones spread throughout, but they're all kind of in their own little corner, and none of them are able to really link up to make anything strong together. And they're not strong enough on their own because none of them have 2 eyes. So you're ending up currently with a bunch of dead groups as white is able to solidify more and more of the territory. And so from here, we can see there's one other thing I want to mention. We can see some of these stones start to get taken. Those threats get resolved. And black is trying to find more places to kind of make some incursions, make some inroads. Right here, there's two things about this. The first is that black does a really nice job of noticing this cut here at F18. That by playing here, black can simply take. And now, what a moment ago looked bad for black is now a nice and stable position and does a lot to strengthen this formation and turn it into something much closer to a territory. And I think that was a good catch. A way to avoid that, I understand the desire to kind of press down strongly and really force black. But again, in playing at G18, we do get to attack black, but in response, black strengthens themselves. So I wonder, instead, as an alternative of playing at F18, it is a move that it doesn't press quite as strongly, but it still is able to help contain those G17 and H18. And also, it gives you a little more leverage to continue pushing out and poke into that territory to try to reduce it. So I think that pulling back a little bit to give yourself a little more stability and more leverage to attack the left side might have ended up being a little bit more fruitful. But still, throughout this, white has done a nice job of really trying to lock down this center area. And so from here, we begin to sort of solidify the territories. These get filled in. And this isn't necessary to go ahead and capture everything to actually turn this, fully capture the stones. As long as everything is settled, both players agree. OGS scoring does a great job on also known what the dame points are, where these in between spots where neither player has points. It also does a good job of recognizing when stones are dead. The other thing too is if the AI is ever wronged you or players disagree, there's always the option in scoring while you're scoring to go back and continue playing it. So you could always resolve it this way if there was ever a disagreement. But it's generally not necessary to do this, so you certainly can. And here I think we have black really trying to make something happen in the corner and getting close, but this is one of those instances where it can be difficult to read, but you want to be, as you get more confident in your reading, you really want to be certain on the order of the stones and exactly who has how many liberties when, right? This is a situation in which you're a couple liberties short. You're just a turn or two short. You needed an extra turn or so to set up, which isn't necessarily possible, but in order for it to happen, you want to do your best to check the game state as it is and see, as it is, can you do it? Can you not? Can you successfully attack? Can you go ahead and encroach? Or do you need something else in order to make it happen? And when it isn't working, that's when you can start to ask yourself, how far am I behind? What part is giving me trouble? Could I set something up else? Could I set something up elsewhere to make it work later? And again, I think we have black just trying to go ahead and see if they can get anything done, but not able to really to capitalize on anything. And again, we saw that white was able to prevent black. White was able to eventually swing around, even though white was originally a little bit too far back. White was originally the one that was being attacked. We were able to see that by the end of it, white had been able to swing around and prevent black from being able to make two eyes, ultimately resolving in the complete capture of all those stones. And so a big reversal from the start of the game. And then this sort of continues as white goes to clear out the stones in their territory, and this is the final result of the game. All right, I think that's going to wrap up our initial analysis of the game. As I said before, I tried to keep this to an hour, and as such, if you're someone who watches this and would like to dive in more, was hoping I would talk about more things, go ahead and comment. Let me know. Let the Groove of War team know, and I'd be happy to go ahead and take the extra time. But I did want to try and also make them accessible, and I know an hour is already. There's a lot to say. I certainly filled it up, but an hour is also a long amount of time. But I did want to add that I'll be doing a review of at least one game per set across the round, and there'll be a highlight video of hopefully about 15-20 minutes that looks at a particular move or two, move highlight in the games. Now, if you're a fan of chess, Wargroove, or just turn-based games in general, which if you're here, you probably are, just want to remind you that the Take Your Turn tournament includes all of those events, and replays from all of those are going to be commentated by a number of very talented people. So I absolutely encourage you to go ahead and if you're at all interested in Wargroove, if you're at all interested in chess, check them out. A lot of these players are going to be playing in those games as well, so you can also see some familiar faces, some familiar names, and I think it's a really wonderful event with a lot there for everyone. But thank you for sticking with me, for reviewing the game with me, and for watching. See you at the next one.